Mike Waddell along with David Glenn with you here on the North Carolina Sports Network. A somber reason for our extra visit this week as we celebrate and remember the life of Eric Scott Montross, age 52. He was a beacon of hope and light on this earth. And David, I know that you and I were both at the Tar Heel Sports Network at the time when Eric was playing on the court from 1990 to 94. You've known him for over 35 years. I mean, a very strong relationship, being a routine guest on your statewide talk show, and always a willing guy to come on and talk about anything, but a passionate Tar Heel, though a son of Indiana.
Yeah, that's well put, Mike, and it is always good to be with you, although these are certainly sad circumstances. I'll do my best to celebrate somebody that I thought was a great man. I mean, my first thought, of course, is I'm sad for his wife, Laura, who he raved about, and someone I got to meet personally. I got to meet his three children, Andrew and Sarah and Megan, just a very impressive, kind-hearted, loving family and great members of the community. But I posted earlier today something on Twitter where I was reminded, given this sad news of Eric's passing, that he once said on that radio show you referred to, "Hey, DG, I would love to tell you that more people come up to me and say, 'Hey, Eric Montross, you're a really great all-around guy.' But instead," Eric told me, "what they usually say is, 'Hey, Big E, I was there when you were bleeding against Duke, and that was totally awesome.'" So, Eric had a great sense of humor about that bloody cheek day against the Blue Devils in a Tar Heel win at the Smith Center. I'll add, way back, some called it, Eric Scott Montross Day because of how he disappeared to get some stitches and then came back and helped the Tar Heels win that game. But he was a humble guy, a self-deprecating guy. That quote kind of reflected his humility. But I told him, because you know me, I'm a Philly guy and I'm a direct communicator. I told Eric on the air and personally, "Hey, bud, there may be more people saying to your face their recollection of the bloody cheek game. And maybe not many people say to your face what an all-around good guy you are. But I'm telling you that that's not only how I view you, that's how a lot of people view you." And, of course, he kind of brushed that kind of off and laughed. But just look at the outpouring of emotion and love toward Eric Montross and these great stories of how he was infinitely bigger than the game of basketball. As you said, Mike, I knew the guy when he was in high school. He was a McDonald's All-American. He was not some under-the-radar recruit. He played in the McDonald's All-American game when it was in his hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana. He disappointed most of the Great Lakes region when he did not pick Michigan or Indiana. Duke was one of his finalists as well, and instead decided to play for Dean Smith. But I knew from back when he was in his late teens that he was not just another basketball star. I didn't know he'd turn out to be such a great dad and such a great husband and such a great broadcaster. But he was a different cat who, if you pushed him, he would talk about basketball. But it became clear from stories he told me about the McDonald's All-American game that his life was not going to be mostly about basketball. He dreamt of playing in the NBA. Of course, he realized that dream. Lottery pick of the famous Boston Celtics after being a national champion with the North Carolina Tar Heels under Dean Smith, that 1993 team. But he was a different cat, man. And I loved the fact that as a young man, but also I knew him for 35 plus years, he was always much bigger than the game of basketball. And he became, think about it, Mike, the gift that he was given was his size, right? There's only so many 7 foot tall, 200 and whatever pound, enormous human beings with skill, the way he had to work to develop those skills. What impresses me most about his life and his legacy is his gift that he had no control over was not one of his greatest gifts. And it was his kindness and his humility and his unselfishness and his charitable spirit and just being a great friend and a kind person and a wonderful father and a wonderful husband, among many other great things.
Well, you mentioned his humor and his height and the way that he could communicate. Now, he and I are both sons of attorneys. So we would joke about that from time to time when I was producing Coach Smith's Carolina Blue Line with Dean Smith, and I would be out in the hallway trying to dodge Coach Guthridge and the SIDs, trying to snag an interview. And, sometimes he would be there. Other times he would duck out along with his teammate George Lynch. But the one thing that I loved about him is that, and he used this on his Twitter bio, I got to tell you, I haven't seen this in over 30 years or thought about it. But I said one time, we're talking to the 7-foot junior from Lawrence North High School, and he said, I'm actually 6'12", which I just loved about Eric Montross. He had that dry, deadpan, Midwestern sense of humor, but always fun and very professional. And, that's one of the things that I'll take in my memories of Eric, though not as saturated as yours obviously are, but also knowing that he was more than just about basketball. In fact, you have a story that's pretty cool about him going to a hockey game.
Yeah, that's true. He's such a humble, self-deprecating guy. He doesn't consider himself famous. He doesn't consider himself a big deal. But because I had gotten to know him pretty well, dating back to basically the end of the 1980s, right? This is a man who sadly just died at 52 years old. I'm only a little bit older than he is. So you do develop a bond when you knew each other at 20 years old and you still know each other in your 50s and you've met each other's families, et cetera. But after growing up in Indiana more as an outdoorsman, he loved to go fishing. He loved country music. He used to joke that his great friend at Carolina, Travis Stevenson, was one of his teammates. He used to joke that they were such country boys that the traffic in Carborough was too much for them. And they needed to get away from it all just to be a little bit more remote from Carborough. But as Eric really put down roots after his graduation and after his NBA career, of course, he returned to the Triangle, and he gradually, with his family, started to become interested in hockey. Well, as you know, I've had season tickets to the Carolina Hurricanes for almost as long as they've been the NHL team here in North Carolina. And for about 20 years, I shared season tickets in the front row. So, I mean, in a seat in a building, PNC Arena with, 20,000 people or whatever the number is for hockey or Wolfpack basketball or something, or a concert, I had some of the best seats in the house. And I used to always say, Eric, I share these with people. You could join me. I had 4 tickets. You could join me. You could take, I couldn't give him 5 tickets for his whole family, but I said, take, your wife and 2 of your kids, or take you and 3 of your kids, or join me. And I'm not exaggerating. For 10 years, he put me off, Mike. I think he just felt like he was imposing. And he's just so self-deprecating. I said, Big E, I didn't feel like I was imposing by asking you to appear on my radio show 1,000 times. Like, how about just saying yes to me the way you said yes to my invitations dozens of times over the years. So finally, he agreed to come on other tickets. I had to trick him to see a hockey game on my dime, so to speak. So he and his son, Andrew, get good tickets, lower level, just the 2 of them. And I believe I had told Andrew and one of my interns, we're going to trick Big E into sitting in the front row. And sure enough, they sat in their original seats. But then I said, why don't you guys just come down and say hi? So I had arranged for these 2 seats right on the glass for he, and Andrew's a tall man as well. Those guys were in the front on the glass. The hockey game is truly a foot away from your nose. And Eric's first response was, these are amazing seats, which means a lot coming from somebody who played in the NBA and had courtside seats as a broadcaster countless times. He was amazed at the point of view. The second thing he said right away, as you'd predict for such a wonderful man, thank you, DG. This is incredible. And the third thing he said, and this also reflects who he is, Mike, DG, I'm really worried. These are expensive seats down here. And with my 7-foot frame and big head, I don't want the people who just paid whatever for the seats behind me to lose sight of the hockey game. So I had to practically beg Eric I'm like, Andrew likes these seats, man. You can't disappoint your son. And I said, the seats are graduated a little bit. So I said, I'll sit behind you. I've seen these games 100 times, so I'll look at the back of your head. So we all laughed and he stayed, and it was a special moment for me because this was, I believe, 4 years ago. This is after a decade of trying to just do nice things for Eric. We used to bring our radio show to UNC Children's Hospital because I knew that was one of his personal causes. And there's actually a great story behind that I hope we get to. But it took me more than a decade to just give a gift of sorts to Eric Montross after he had given the gift of his time, his wisdom, his humor, his expertise to me personally from the time he was 17 years old and I interviewed him as a McDonald's All-American high school player, literally until he was diagnosed early this year with cancer. Since then, I believe all of our communications have been just by text. And I noticed something that I don't want to forget to mention, so I'll tell you now, Mike. I'm a little bit all over the place because it's just a sad, emotional day for a lot of people, starting with his family, but also people like me who just were positively impacted by many years of getting to know him. I'm one of those people who doesn't delete a lot of texts, so I was just kind of scrolling through our exchanges over the years, and there was a lot of stuff. You know, this is a man who loved his wife, Laura, and I saw a lot of great references to her in there. Loved his 3 kids. A lot of great references, hockey and otherwise, and we met up sometimes on the concourse in between periods when his family was there and my family was there. The only text that he did not respond to in my 5 years that I have on my phone scrolling through, I don't have anything prior to 2018, I think. The only one he did not respond to was when I said to him, Eric, you know I'm a direct communicator, and I hope you know I'm not BSing you. If you need bone marrow or anything else from my body, and I'm a match for your mountain of a man, body chemistry, tell me where to go and what to donate, and I will do it. I sent that in the spring when I didn't even know the details of what cancer he was battling. And it was a gloomy outlook. And he was positive through the whole thing. And he returned all my other texts after that. And we had wonderful exchanges, including not too long ago. But I think I don't know. I don't think the type of cancer he had would have been helped by my offer. Who knows if I would have been a match. But I made him promise, or I tried to make him promise, that if I could help, I would help. And I think he knew me well enough to know that that was not a hollow offer. But that shows how highly I have thought of him since I was impressed by him as an 18-year-old, and I was only a couple years older than he at the time, all the way through watching him blossom as a husband, as a father, as a charitable man with his Father's Day camp. And with the way, even as a glitzy, glamorous UNC basketball player back then, I'm telling you, man, when a lot of his teammates were partying on Franklin Street, not that there's anything wrong with that, Eric was either spending time with his wife-to-be, or this is not a Hallmark card, this is real. He was spending time at UNC hospitals with pediatric cancer patients. And for those who don't know, that father-son basketball camp was a byproduct of Eric Montross developing a friendship with a young man who was battling cancer as a young teenager, I believe, at the time. And he became so close to this young man during his time as a Tar Heel player. I mean, imagine this 7-foot famous guy coming to visit you in your hospital bed as you're battling this dreaded disease. That was not a token appearance by Eric Montross. The guy truly turned those visits, which of course made his coach Dean Smith proud, and his teammates went too, but he turned it into a lifetime endeavor. He turned it into, I think they raised almost $2 million in the fight against cancer with his father-son basketball camp, where he would be the MC and he'd be catching the ball and passing the ball, but also giving inspirational speeches and watching fathers and children come together. Again, he was just much bigger than basketball. And don't let me forget to tell you a story he told me from the McDonald's All-American game, because it was a precursor to the fact that he was going to live the life of, yes, a great basketball player who was 7 feet tall and eventually very skilled, but knew from the beginning that he was going to be much more than a basketball player before he left this earth.
That's David Glenn. I'm Mike Waddell. We're talking about Eric Montross, a life so well lived, passing away on Sunday at the age of 52. Former North Carolina men's basketball player from 1990 through 1994, a member of the 1993 NCAA champion men's basketball team at the University of North Carolina for the legendary Coach Dean Smith. And you mentioned, David, like Coach Smith, like Coach Hatchell from the women's basketball program, and numerous other great leaders of the North Carolina Tar Heels athletics department. They've been very involved. The Lineberger Cancer Center and fundraising for that entity have really changed the lives of so many. But this summer basketball camp that you talked about, a lot of people know about that. A lot of people might not, because it was darn near impossible to get in. I was after Eric one year. I said, hey, man, I'll do whatever I can for you. I'll bring you all this Under Armour gear. It was when I was the AD at Towson. I said, I just got to get in here with my son. He says, Mike, we're just sold out. We're oversold. And I said, well, add a week, Coach Smith would. But he chuckled at that. But what a great way and a legacy that he didn't even know, an unintentional legacy, his work with Lineberger Cancer Center.
So true. And for those who want to learn more about that aspect, and it's just one branch of this incredible tree that, that is the life that Eric Montross lived, there's a website, montrossbasketballcamp.com. And it includes additional details of what I mentioned earlier. The young man that Eric, again, at the time, the 7-foot UNC superstar, who, by the way, was an academic All-American, super, super smart guy, very different than most of the McDonald's All-Americans that I interviewed over the years. I mean, he was talking, Mike, about reading Louis L'Amour books and some of his other favorite authors. Now, again, he loved basketball, worked his tail off with basketball, was dedicated to basketball, superstar, national champion, All-American, but also academic All-American during his time with the Tar Heels, and then a significant pro career as well. But the young man he met was named Jason Clark. Jason at the time was a 15-year-old cancer patient. Eric at the time, remember, was only probably 20 or 21 years old and a UNC basketball superstar. They became really close friends. I mean, Eric over the years, I'm sure, visited hundreds, if not thousands, of young cancer patients. But some of them he became close to, and Jason was one of them. And during Jason's time in the hospital, he came up with a list of possible improvements for the other young people battling cancer there at the hospital. And he passed away within the next couple of years, and Eric and his wife, Laura, created the Eric Montross basketball camp as a byproduct of their friendship with Jason Clark. And again, they ended up raising, I believe it's $2 million or in that neighborhood over the course of 25 plus years. So Eric was a man who wanted to be bigger than basketball. And again, man, looking at him, you would think the most unique quality he has is being a mountain of a man and 7 feet tall and an All-American and a national champion basketball player. But man, who would not want to be remembered by the concept of being an even better person than you were great at what you chose to do for a living? And as much as I loved Eric as a broadcaster and as a basketball player, he was an even better person. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And that is about as good a thing as someone can have on their tombstone as anything I've ever heard.
And I look back over my knowledge of North Carolina basketball, went to my first game in 1970. So it goes back a ways. I'm trying to think of who does he remind me of that played in the Carolina blue and white. And I got to tell you, it wasn't anybody that played at Carolina. He really reminded me of a Bill Bradley, somebody who was an academic, played basketball at Princeton along with the Knicks and in the NBA, and went on to a great career in elected office in Washington, D.C. But that's the type of intellect that Eric Montross was. In fact, I know his father, Scott, was an attorney, like my father, Lewis, who was an attorney here in North Carolina. And Scott and Eric and I would talk about that from time to time. And I said, heck, man, you'll probably end up being like, even though you didn't go to Michigan, you might be like that Michigan guy, Byron White, known as Whizzer, who was a former NFL player back in the 30s that played for the Wolverines. But, that was the one thing. And you look at big guys, and we're going to talk about what a great guy Eric was. The guy was a hell of a basketball player, too. And it's that 1993 team. And the last time Eric and I talked, it was shortly after I had taken a job outside of college athletics a few years ago, and we were connecting on a donor matter. And he and I were talking just about, man, I really expected you to be a Supreme Court justice or something like that. And he said, man, I hope somebody remembers the fact that I actually could play too. And that 93 team gets dissed a lot with titles in 5 and 17 and 2009 and all of that. But that was a really good team. But they were a great team because of people like George Lynch and Derek Phelps and, of course, Eric Montross that really held that group together. The sum was greater than any individual part. And I think that really speaks a lot to what kind of a person he was. And so many of his teammates continue to be as great leaders that they are off that 1993 NCAA championship team.
Yeah, a lot comes to mind as you share those thoughts, Mike, because, again, as someone just slightly older than that group, I covered them very, very closely back when they were 18 to 23-year-olds. And I remember they were considered, seriously, one of the greatest basketball recruiting classes in history. And it was around that time that guy 8 miles down the road at Duke, Mike Krzyzewski, was in the process of building a back-to-back national championship program in 1991 and 92. Now, on the 93 teams, which turned out to be Dean Smith's sledgehammer response to the back-to-back titles at Duke, George Lynch was a senior on that team, but Eric Montross was a junior and part of that best recruiting class ever. That also included Derek Phelps was in the locker room at that McDonald's All-American game. Brian Reese was in the locker room at that McDonald's All-American game. So all three of those guys knew that they were about to be college teammates. Current UNC assistant coach Pat Sullivan wasn't in the McDonald's game, but was a well-regarded player from New Jersey who signed in that same class of 1990. So they were all juniors when Donald Williams was the sophomore, George Lynch was the senior, and then that best recruiting class ever, or one of them, was helping the Tar Heels to win the national championship. And two quick things, because you mentioned how Eric would duck out occasionally as a young man when you were looking for an interview. When I interviewed him as a young man, and this is sometimes I forget the exact definition of the word irony, but it feels ironic. Eric Montross told me as a 20-year-old UNC basketball star, DG, to be honest, I really love playing the game of basketball. I don't like talking about it. And, of course, he made his living talking about the game of basketball, which just makes my head spin in a funny way. Maybe he would even be here laughing with us if he recalled that quote. But what he was trying to say is he didn't like talking about himself, and he was much more of a doer than he was a talker. So when he would be interviewed, he was always polite, always professional. And I mean, as a young man, obviously as a broadcaster as well, always insightful. I would have him on the radio show because he helped me understand the sport better, the ACC better, the Tar Heels better, a particular team better, Coach Smith or Coach Williams or somebody else better. I mean, his IQ is through the roof. So I was always intrigued. You ask him an intelligent question, man, you're going to get an intelligent, thoughtful answer. But it's so funny that the guy who didn't like to talk that much back as a player ends up talking about basketball for a living. And then one other quick story from those days, because it involves the locker room I was describing. The McDonald's All-American game was in Indianapolis that year. And Eric Montross, again, Lawrence North, as you mentioned, he got to not only be a McDonald's All-American, the game was played in his backyard. So, Brian Reese is coming from the Bronx, and Derek Phelps is coming from elsewhere in New York, and these other prep stars from all over the country. And the McDonald's game back then was an even bigger deal than it is now. And, in the internet era where there's just a lot more splintering of it and there's more all-star games, the McDonald's All-American game was the bomb. It was the thing. And a story that Montross told me, this is, again, back when he's probably 20 years old and in the process of helping the Heels to lots of success, including that 93 national championship. He gave me a lot of really good stuff, but I had to pepper him with questions. And because, again, he didn't like to talk about himself. He was even self-deprecating back then. But if you asked him a good question, he would give you a good answer. And I asked about having the McDonald's game at home. And he shared a story from the locker room, Mike, that I think I made the lead in an article I wrote about him in a magazine called Carolina Court that I was freelancing for way back as a very young writer myself. And as the story goes, all the McDonald's players, remember, keep in mind, these are 17-year-old superstars, the best high school basketball players in America. Many of them knew each other, but many others are meeting for the first time. This was not quite the AAU circuit where everybody knew everybody. It wasn't quite there yet. So they were asked to introduce themselves in the locker room. And as Eric Montross shared the story with me, and it was a relatively fresh story that had only taken place a year or two prior to him sharing it with me, as the players are asked to give quick self-intros, it'd be, hey, I'm Mike Waddell from so-and-so, North Carolina. I averaged 25 points a game last year. Our team won the state title. My dad was a lawyer. My mom played college basketball at so-and-so. It was just a quick intro to say hello to everybody. So man after man, they're saying predictable things. How good you are at basketball, where you're from, maybe some of your team's accomplishments, personal accomplishments, and then maybe something personal. But it was mostly what you'd predict from 17-year-old prep stars. It gets to Montross, and he, not trying to be funny, says, "My name is Eric Montross. I'm from Lawrence North High School right here in Indianapolis where we're going to be playing this game. And I love nature. I really love nature." Can you imagine? And there was laughter throughout the room. Like even the adults were laughing. Eric was not trying to be funny. He was just trying to share something authentic about himself. Anybody who's been, whether it's in first grade or eighth grade or high school, when you say something not trying to be funny, and people start laughing at you, that's not the most fun feeling in the world. Eric, for as long as I knew him, was wired in a way that it was just no big deal. He was going to share something that was important to him. It's okay that the 10 guys who introduced themselves before him didn't say anything that far astray from sports and that personal, or maybe even that much of risk, to have these other teenage boys laughing at you and some of the directors of the tournament laughing at you. Now, he said they weren't mean-spirited laughing. They weren't mocking him, but they just didn't expect this 7-foot giant to say nothing about basketball, nothing about his statistics, nothing about his personal or team accomplishments, but after saying his name and his high school, "I love nature. I really love nature." And he did. And he was an outdoorsman, and he loved outdoorsman type books and outdoorsman authors. And he wanted to share that, even in that very basketball centric setting. And I'm impressed not only by the story and his unflappable, why should I be embarrassed? Just because everybody's laughing kind of at me, kind of with me. I'm impressed that a couple years later, he was willing to share that story with someone who was in the process of writing a profile about him. A lot of people would be, I don't know, second guessing whether they should share that story because maybe it doesn't make them look good. I don't know. Eric didn't have any of those concerns, man. He was who he was, and he was ready to share it, even in that unusual context. And it was the truth. He was a great basketball player, but he was also an avid outdoorsman. And the funny postscript on that is because Derek Phelps and Brian Reese were in the room at the time he told that story and they saw everybody laugh, they later told Pat Sullivan that story. And as Eric tells it, for the next 4 years, as they're all Carolina players, they all called Eric Nature Boy as his nickname because of that McDonald's locker room story, which, of course, brings up Nature Boy Ric Flair here to North Carolinians. They called Eric Montross Nature Boy for an entirely different reason that had nothing to do with the squared circle.
Throughout today's broadcast, as we remember Eric Montross, you will see at the bottom of the screen a web address for bethematchfoundation.org. Please go there and look and see if you can do as David did, offer and be a donor of marrow or whatever thing. I'm a donor. Had been a donor of a living donor transplant in my own family. and am an organ donor too. So between being an organ donor and being especially marrow donor for people going through certain types of cancers, you can help extend a life. And I tell you, in this holiday season, it has been a really rough fall for North Carolina men's basketball, losing two of the greats in Walter Sweet D. Davis and now double zero Eric Montross, both jerseys in the rafters at the Dean Smith Center. David, a final word?
You know, I'm a better person for having known Eric Montross. That's probably the best way I could sum it up. And I think the world's a better place for having him. I'm not sure I can say much more than that, man. It's been an emotional day. I'm glad I've been able to laugh through some of these stories because it's a sad day.
And let's keep all the folks in our hearts and prayers. Adam Lucas, who wrote a great piece on GoHeels.com earlier today. Jones Angel, who I got to tell you, if there's anybody who probably looks back today and is really having a tough one, is Jones Angel, because he had to be the guy that not only took over for, Woody Durham, but, Eric was there to transition that in. So those folks, the people that you work with, especially when you're looking at the period of time that Eric Montross is around Chapel Hill as an athlete, as a retired player, and then as a member of the Rams Club staff, for John Montgomery and the folks doing the great work over there. Very tough day for people in Chapel Hill. David, thank you for your time here on the North Carolina Sports Network.
Thank you, Mike. And our love, of course, to Laura and Sarah and Andrew and Megan, the wonderful wife and really impressive 3 kids that Eric has left behind. Obviously, I think the guy's going to live together because of his live forever, I should say, because of the things you and I have been able to talk about today. And obviously the memories that so many others are sharing about him. His legacy means a lot. And there are countless people like you and me who see the world in a little brighter way and maybe even became a little better people ourselves for having crossed paths with Eric Montross. So thanks for throwing some softballs my way today, Mike. This is a fun topic, a sad topic, a happy topic in different ways, all at the same time, but I'm glad we were able to do this.